Someone has already told you what is possible for you. It may not have been said directly. It may have arrived through a number on a screen, a conversation that ended badly, a birthday that felt more like a warning than a celebration, or a quiet comparison between your life and someone else's. But the sentence was delivered, and somewhere beneath the surface of your daily thoughts, you received it. The world has a habit of speaking futures. It reads your age, your bank balance, your industry, your family history, your past failures, and the current state of the economy, and it assembles a verdict. It does not ask whether you agree. It simply announces. And the announcement sounds so factual, so grounded in evidence, so responsible and realistic that refusing it feels almost foolish. But this is the precise moment this teaching is designed to address. Not the outer announcement, not the statistic or the comparison or the bad news. This teaching addresses what happens inside you in the second after the world speaks. Because that second, that invisible inner turn, is where your future is actually decided. Not by the world, by you, by what you allow to name you. There is a name the world has given your future, and there is another name. And by the end of this teaching, you will know exactly which authority has the right to speak, which voice you have been obeying, and how to return the naming power to where it has always belonged. Consider what it means to name something. To name a thing is to declare what it is. It is to set its nature, its category, its limit, and its direction. When something is named, it is placed. When something is named, it is governed. This is not merely a philosophical observation. It is a principle that runs through the deepest layers of conscious and subconscious life. Whatever names your future effectively governs your expectation, and whatever governs your expectation shapes the energy, the attention, and the inner posture you bring into every day. The world does not name your future with malice. It names from what it sees. It names from statistics and averages, from economic reports and cultural patterns, from what happened to others in similar circumstances, from what failed before under similar conditions. The world is, in a very real sense, a naming machine. It takes visible data and produces verdicts. The verdict arrives wearing the costume of realism. When the world looks at your age and calls your future late, it is naming from a statistic. When it looks at your bank balance and calls your future insufficient, it is naming from a number. When it looks at your industry or job market and calls your future uncertain, it is naming from a pattern. None of these names arrive as cruelty. They arrive as information, and this is precisely why they are so dangerous. The danger is not that the world is lying. The world is often reporting something real. The danger is that a report about the present is not the same as a decree about the future. A condition is not a verdict, a pattern is not a law, a number is not a sentence. But when the naming enters without correction, consciousness tends to receive it as if it were final. And finality is the beginning of surrender. This is the hidden inversion most people never see. They believe they are accepting reality. They believe they are being responsible and grounded and honest. They believe that acknowledging the world's report is a sign of maturity. But what they are actually doing, in that moment of inner agreement, is handing the authority over their future to an external voice that only has the power of the temporary. Here is a question that may already be pressing against something inside you. What name has the world given to your future? Has it called it late? Has it called it already decided, already damaged, already too far behind? Has it called it limited by your history, your family pattern, your previous failure, or the current state of the visible world? And more importantly, and this is the question beneath the question, have you agreed? Most people have agreed without knowing they agreed. The agreement was not dramatic. It was not a surrender ceremony. It was simply a moment when the world's language entered the mind and was not refused. And because it was not refused, it was in the logic of consciousness accepted. And what is accepted as true in consciousness begins to govern the shape of expectation, the tone of prayer, the size of effort, and the direction of attention. This is why the work of this teaching is not about outer conditions at all. It is about inner authority. It is about who or what has been given the right to declare what is true about your future. And Emmet Fox, one of the most precise spiritual teachers of the 20th century, would say that there is only one voice that carries the legitimate authority to name your future. And that voice does not speak through statistics. It does not speak through bad news. It does not speak through comparison or delay or visible limitation. It speaks from a different order entirely. Emmet Fox taught with unusual precision about the relationship between consciousness and condition, between the inner life and the outer world, between the authority we serve and the results we receive. His teaching was not a collection of comforting phrases. It was a structured understanding of spiritual law, drawn from deep study of Scripture and applied with clarity to the practical life of the individual. And at the center of that teaching was a conviction that ran through everything he wrote and everything he taught. God is the only final authority over reality. This was not a sentimental claim for Fox. It was a structural one. He understood the spiritual universe as one in which God, or the infinite creative intelligence behind all life, is the cause and the substance and the governing principle of all that exists. The outer world, the visible conditions, the appearances of limitation and difficulty and delay, were not, in his understanding, the source of anything. They were effects, they were reports, they were temporary forms produced by consciousness. And consciousness was always connected to something deeper than itself. From this foundation, Fox drew a sharp and practical distinction. There are two voices that can name your future. The voice of appearances, which speaks from what has already been formed, from past conditions, from visible evidence, from the statistics of the outer world. And the voice of God consciousness, which speaks from what is eternally possible, from divine supply, from the infinite ordering principle that does not calculate from past failure or present limitation. Fox would insist, and insist with calm authority, that the world's naming power is borrowed, not real. The world names from effects and calls them causes. The world looks at what has been produced and pronounces a verdict on what can be produced. But the true cause of all things is not the condition. The true cause is the consciousness that meets the condition, and the deepest root of that consciousness, when properly aligned, is God. This places the naming authority in an entirely different location than most people have been taught to look. Most people look at the outer world for information about what is possible. They scan the evidence, they read the numbers, they study the market, they listen to the verdict of their circumstances, and then they form their expectation on the basis of what they find. This is the ordinary way. Fox did not teach the ordinary way. He taught what he called scientific prayer, a precise inner turning from the appearance to the truth, not a denial of outer conditions, not an instruction to ignore practical reality, but a deliberate act of spiritual allegiance in which the mind refuses to let the appearance be the final word. In scientific prayer, the practitioner turns from what appears to be to what God declares to be. And what God declares to be is always abundance, order, supply, right timing, open channels, and divine completion. Here is what this means in the context of the naming of your future. When God names your future, it is not named from your past failures. It is not named from your age or your delay or the economy or what your family told you was possible. God names from a different order entirely. God names from the principle of infinite supply. God names from the reality of divine timing. God names from the truth that the invisible cause always precedes and governs the visible effect. This does not mean that all outer evidence will immediately change the moment you shift your inner allegiance. Fox was careful about this. He taught a patient, disciplined inner transformation. But he was equally clear that as long as the world retains the naming authority inside you, the change you are waiting for is working against an internal contradiction. You are praying for a future the world has already named impossible. And the subconscious, which receives the dominant impression, is receiving two instructions at once. When the world names your future late, and you accept that name, and then you pray for open doors, you are praying from a divided state. The prayer asks for one thing, the accepted name expects another. Fox understood this division as the hidden reason prayer often feels weak or circular. The prayer is real. The sincerity is real, but the inner authority has not yet been returned to God. The world still holds the naming power. The first step in restoring divine authority to your future is understanding that God names differently than the world names. The world names from statistics, God names from substance, the world names from history, God names from eternal potential, the world names from visible channels. God names from infinite supply that is not dependent on any single door, or any single source, or any single timing pattern that the world considers reasonable. When Fox pointed people toward God as source, he was not offering a religious sentiment. He was offering a structural correction. He was saying in precise spiritual terms that as long as you let the appearance be the cause, you are working backwards. The appearance is never the cause. The consciousness behind the appearance is the cause. And the deepest, most powerful level of that consciousness is the God self within you, the divine intelligence that knows no limitation and speaks no word of defeat. This is why the first and most essential act of practical spiritual work, according to the framework Fox laid out, is the act of returning the naming authority to God, not the world, not the economy, not the past, not other people's opinions, not the bank statement, not the fear of being too late. God names your future, and God's vocabulary contains no word for impossible, no word for too late, no word for permanently blocked, and no word for forgotten. Now let us look carefully at what the world is actually doing when it names your future, because there is an important distinction to hold here, one that Fox made with great precision. The world does not name your future out of malice. The world does not conspire against you. The world names from the only material it has. And the only material the world has access to is appearance. Appearance is the accumulated visible record of what has already been produced. It is the collection of past decisions, past conditions, economic patterns, social statistics, biological timelines, and historical data. The world assembles this record and draws conclusions. When it looks at a person in their 50s who is beginning a new chapter of life, it draws conclusions from demographic data and labor market trends. When it looks at a person who has failed in a business twice before, it draws conclusions from statistics about third attempts. When it looks at a bank account that has been empty for several months, it draws conclusions about likely near-term trajectories. None of this is evil. Much of it is genuinely useful information. The problem arises not when you receive this information, but when you allow it to become your authority. There is a difference between looking at a number and making practical plans, and looking at a number and deciding what God can and cannot do in your life. There is a difference between acknowledging a pattern and accepting a permanent verdict. The world routinely slides from reporting to decreeing. And because the language of the world is so fluent in the vocabulary of evidence, the slide is almost invisible. Fox would bring us back again and again to the same essential principle. Appearances are effects, not causes. The state of the visible world at any given moment is always a report of what has already been caused. It is never the determination of what can be caused. To let the effect name the future is to let the past govern the possible. And the possible, in the spiritual framework Fox taught, is always governed by God, not by what has already appeared. Consider the economy. When the economy contracts, the world names futures accordingly. It names them uncertain, it names them difficult, it names them reduced. And millions of people receive this name without ever questioning its authority. They shrink their prayers, they reduce their expectations, they make smaller plans. They approach their lives as if God's supply has also contracted, as if the infinite creative intelligence that sustains all things has read the same reports and drawn the same conclusions. But Fox would point us back to a simple, precise truth. God is not a channel. God is the source. And when a particular channel narrows or closes, the source does not change. This is one of the most important distinctions in the teaching of Emmet Fox. The world confuses channels with sources. A job is a channel. An economy is a channel. A business opportunity is a channel. A specific client or contract or door is a channel. When a channel closes, the world names this as loss of supply. But Fox taught that the supply was never in the channel. The supply is in God. And God can open new channels, unexpected channels, channels that no statistical report has yet mapped, channels that no social comparison has yet identified, channels that the world's naming machine has not yet reached. This means that the world's naming power is genuinely limited, not because the world is wrong about its data, but because its data only covers what has already appeared. The world cannot see the divine cause that is already moving behind the next appearance. The world cannot measure the invisible order that is already assembling the conditions for a new result. The world can only name from what it sees, and what it sees is always the past made visible. When the world looks at your situation and names it poor or late or damaged or behind, it is looking at an effect and speaking as if it were a cause. But you are not the sum of your visible history. You are a consciousness, and your consciousness is connected to a source that the world cannot measure and has never been able to name. Here is where the teaching becomes intensely practical. If you allow the world's name for your future to enter your consciousness and settle there, you have not merely received information, you have installed an instruction. The subconscious mind does not distinguish carefully between what the world has said about your future and what is spiritually true about your future. It receives the dominant impression. It accepts the picture that is held with the most emotional consistency, and when the world's verdict is accepted without correction, it becomes the picture. And the subconscious begins to organize your energy, your attention, your decisions, and your inner state around the picture the world gave you. This is the mechanism Fox's teaching is designed to interrupt, not by pretending the world's data does not exist, not by telling you to ignore practical information, but by showing you that the world's naming power has a ceiling, and that ceiling is the boundary of the visible. Beyond the visible, the God mind is at work. The divine order is already in motion. The supply is already moving toward its expression. And the only question is whether your consciousness will be aligned with the world's verdict or with the higher name. The world speaks from fear because fear is the natural language of a mind that knows only the visible. When the visible shows scarcity, fear names the future scarce. When the visible shows delay, fear names the future late. When the visible shows failure, fear names the future defeated. Fear is not lying about what it sees. Fear is simply limited in its vision. It cannot see beyond the appearance. It cannot read the cause behind the effect. And this is why fear must never be the final naming authority in your life. Fox placed great emphasis on the spiritual practice of turning the attention away from the appearance and toward God. This was not an instruction to become irresponsible or impractical. It was an instruction to restore the correct inner order. The appearance reports. God governs. And when you have turned inwardly to God as the source and the naming authority, you are then equipped to look at practical information without allowing it to become a spiritual verdict. This is the position Fox called spiritual clarity. You can read the market without the market reading your future. You can look at the number without the number speaking your identity. You can receive difficult news without the news becoming the name of your life. The information passes through a properly ordered consciousness without being installed as the governing authority. And that properly ordered consciousness, the one that knows God is the source and the world is only the appearance, is the consciousness from which effective prayer, effective action, and genuine transformation becomes possible. If you are going to subscribe to this kind of teaching, subscribe now, because this channel is for those who know that the visible world is not the final authority. Sacred logic exists to translate the hidden laws behind supply, prayer, consciousness, and divine order into the practical correction your inner life is waiting for. There is a moment most people cannot identify in themselves because it does not announce itself as surrender. It arrives in the ordinary texture of a discouraging day. Someone makes a comment about the job market and your age. A number appears in your bank account, and it is not what you hoped for. A comparison surfaces between your timeline and someone else's. A door closes that you were certain was the right one. And in that moment, something happens inside you that is almost wordless. A quiet agreement, an inward nod, a small but decisive collapse of a boundary that was previously holding a different expectation. You did not consciously decide to accept the label. You did not sit down and formally agree that your future is late or poor or impossible. It happened in the way most inner changes happen, gradually, subtly, through repetition and emotional weight, until one day you realize that the sentence the world spoke about your future has become the sentence you speak inside your own mind. This is the error that looks like accepting reality. It wears the clothes of maturity. It sounds like groundedness. It uses responsible language. When the inner agreement is challenged, it defends itself with phrases such as, "I'm just being realistic," or "I have to face the facts," or "I am not living in denial." And because these phrases sound wise, the agreement is almost never questioned. It is welcomed in as a form of clarity when it is, in the most precise spiritual sense, a form of surrender. Fox would name this with care. He would not shame the person for feeling discouraged. He understood that human beings are deeply influenced by their environments, by repetition, by social consensus, by the accumulated weight of things that have not yet worked. He did not pretend this influence was easy to resist, but he would insist that discouragement and agreement are not the same thing. You can feel the weight of a difficult season without letting that season name your future. You can acknowledge a closed door without letting the closed door become your identity. The moment of inner agreement is the precise moment the teaching is designed to interrupt, because everything that follows from that moment builds on the foundation of the accepted label. If the label is late, then every plan made from that moment forward is quietly shaped by the assumption of lateness. If the label is insufficient, then every prayer offered from that moment forward carries the undertone of insufficiency. The label becomes the inner climate, and the inner climate becomes the lens through which all incoming information is filtered and interpreted. Here's a question to sit with honestly. When someone congratulates another person for a success that you have not yet achieved, what does your inner voice say? Does it say that your time is coming? That God's timing is not the world's timing? That the divine order is at work? Or does it say something quieter and heavier, something that has the texture of the label the world gave you? That inner response is diagnostic. It reveals whether the world's name or God's name is currently governing your expectation. The tragedy of the accepted label is not simply that it feels painful. The deeper tragedy is that it feels accurate. The person who has accepted the label of late does not experience it as a false verdict. They experience it as a clear-eyed reading of reality. They can show you the evidence. They can point to the timelines, the comparisons, the closed doors, the accumulated delays. The evidence feels conclusive, and because it feels conclusive, the inner agreement feels not like surrender, but like honesty. But here is what Fox would bring forward at exactly this point. The evidence the world shows you is always evidence about effects, never evidence about causes. The delays are effects, the closed doors are effects, the comparisons are effects. None of them have any power to determine what the divine cause can produce next. They report the past made visible. They have absolutely no jurisdiction over what an aligned consciousness, connected to infinite supply, is capable of receiving in the immediate future. When you inwardly agree with the label, you are not seeing reality more clearly. You are accepting a partial reality, the part the world can see, and treating it as the whole. The whole reality includes the invisible cause. The whole reality includes the divine order that is already in motion behind the appearance. The whole reality includes a supply that does not depend on the channels the world considers available. The whole reality includes a timing that is not measured by the timelines the world considers reasonable. The error is invisible because it hides inside the language of responsibility. It says, "I need to be realistic." It says, "I should not get my hopes up." It says, "I have to plan based on what is actually in front of me." None of these statements are wrong on their own. Responsibility is not the enemy of spiritual law. Planning is not the enemy of prayer. But when the language of responsibility is used to install a false name for your future, something deeper has been lost. The ground of faith, the expectation of divine supply, the inner posture of receiving, has been traded for the temporary comfort of resigned agreement. Fox taught that resignation is not peace. Resignation is a closed hand. Peace is an open one. The resigned person has stopped expecting God to act. The person at peace has turned toward God and is waiting in the certainty of divine order. These two states feel similar from the outside. Both are quiet. Both have stopped straining. But their inner structures are entirely different. One has accepted the label. The other has refused it and returned to God. The soul that has accepted the world's label is not less worthy of divine supply. It is not being punished. It has not made a permanent mistake. But it is operating from an inner climate that will tend to reproduce the conditions of the label, not because it is doomed, but because consciousness is always creative. The accepted name creates an expectation. The expectation shapes attention. The attention shapes the inner state. And the inner state, consistently held, shapes what consciousness is available to receive. This is the mechanism, not punishment, not fate, not the universe deciding against you. Simply the law of consciousness operating according to its own nature. The name you hold inwardly tends to shape the world you inhabit outwardly. And if the name you are holding was given to you by the appearance, by the economy, by the comparison, by the delay, by the fear, then you are not seeing your future clearly. You are seeing the world's verdict about your past projected forward. And this is why the act of refusing the label is not denial. It is not irresponsibility. It is the most precise and powerful spiritual act available to a human consciousness. It is the act of returning the naming authority to its proper source. It is the act of saying, in the language of sacred law, that the world does not have the final word. Once the inner agreement is made, something even more consequential begins to happen. The accepted label does not remain a passive belief. It becomes a script. And the script governs behavior in ways the person rarely traces back to the original moment of agreement. This is the second layer of the mechanism, and it is where the accepted name does its most lasting damage. Consider what happens when a person accepts the label of too late. They may continue to act, to apply for opportunities, to pursue goals. On the surface, they appear to be moving forward, but beneath the surface, the script of too late is quietly shaping every decision. They set smaller goals because the larger ones now feel foolish under the jurisdiction of that label. They pursue opportunities with less energy because the energy of genuine expectation has been replaced by the energy of going through the motions. They settle for less and call it being realistic. They adjust their prayers downward and call it humility. The label of too late does not necessarily stop action. It reduces the quality of action from the inside. And reduced inner quality is often invisible until you look at the results over time and notice that they consistently confirm the label. Not because the label was prophetically accurate, but because consciousness shaped by the label produced a pattern of effort, prayer, and expectation that was secretly already in agreement with the verdict. Fox would recognize this as a form of inner contradiction. The outer action says, "I am trying." The inner script says it probably will not work. The prayer asks for supply. The inner script names the supply as unlikely, and the subconscious, receiving both signals, tends to default to the signal that is held with the most emotional depth and the most consistent repetition. In most cases, the fear-based script is more emotionally consistent than the prayer, not because the prayer is less sincere, but because the accepted label has been rehearsed longer and with more inner evidence. This is the hidden cost of agreed labels. They do not just name the future. They script the actions, the prayers, the decisions, the inner posture, and the emotional tone of every day that follows. The person who has accepted the label of insufficient does not pray the same way as the person who knows God is their supply. The person who has accepted the label of too damaged does not take new risks the same way as the person who knows divine order can restore what appears broken. The label shapes the lived experience from the inside out. One of the most subtle expressions of the script is what happens to imagination. When the world names your future impossible or late or too damaged, your imagination tends to contract. The large open pictures that once came naturally, the ones that felt like genuine inner vision, begin to feel irresponsible under the weight of the label. You stop entertaining them. You replace them with smaller, safer, more defensible images of the future. And because imagination is closely related to the inner state, and the inner state is the ground of prayer, the contraction of imagination is also a contraction of receptivity. Emmet Fox understood the imagination as one of the primary faculties of spiritual work. Not imagination as fantasy or wishful thinking, but imagination as the inner act of holding a picture in the mind with a sense of reality and completion. When the label replaces the God-given picture of the future, it replaces it with an image that the world has already approved, because the world can see it forming. The God-given picture, the one that comes from divine supply and divine timing, is always ahead of the evidence. It always looks unreasonable to the world's naming machine. And when the label has been accepted, those God-given pictures feel too risky to hold. There is also what happens to prayer. A person operating under an accepted label rarely prays from supply. They pray from desperation. They approach God not as an open channel for receiving what is already prepared, but as a last resort when all outer channels have closed. The prayer becomes a negotiation. It carries an undertone of anxiety, of proving need, of hoping that God will make an exception. Fox identified this kind of prayer as sincere but spiritually confused. The sincere desire for help is real, but the posture beneath the prayer is still governed by the world's verdict. The label also affects the kind of opportunities the person pursues and the kind they dismiss. Under the script of too late, a person may encounter an opportunity that requires courage and timing. But because the label says the timing is wrong, because the evidence says it is a long shot, because the inner script runs the calculation of probable failure, the opportunity is passed. And because it is passed, the label is confirmed, and the confirmation deepens the script. This is how accepted names create patterns that persist across years without anyone seeing the original agreement that started them. Reduced effort, smaller prayers, fear-based action, and narrowed imagination are not character flaws. They are the logical expressions of a consciousness that has accepted the world's name as final. They make perfect sense inside the logic of the label. If the future is already named late and insufficient and difficult, then large effort, large prayer, and large imagination feel like self-deception. The label creates its own internal coherence, and this is precisely what makes it so difficult to interrupt without a genuine spiritual teaching. Fear-based action deserves particular attention here. When supply feels threatened and the world has named the future as uncertain, the natural response is action from panic. The person begins to chase. They pursue every visible channel with urgency. They send messages and make calls and apply for opportunities, not from the inner authority of divine order, but from the frantic energy of someone who believes the source is running out. This kind of action is exhausting, and it rarely produces the results that aligned, ordered action produces. Not because effort is wrong, but because the inner state from which the effort is made is already in agreement with lack. Fox would point out that this kind of chasing is also a form of following the world's name. The world has named the future scarce. The chasing is the behavioral expression of agreement with that name. The body is moving, the effort is real, but the consciousness behind the effort is operating from the assumption that God is insufficient. And an assumption held consistently in consciousness tends to produce the experiences that confirm it. The desire for renaming begins here, in the honest recognition that something has been steering the inner life that was never given the right to do so. Not God, not divine order, not spiritual law, but a label, a name the world gave and the inner life accepted. And as long as that name remains installed as the governing authority, even sincere spiritual work will feel circular, because the root of the inner authority has not yet been changed. Write this in the comments as your sacred decree. The world does not name my future. The first act of renaming is refusal, and refusal is not what most people think it is. It is not the loud, dramatic rejection of a statement you disagree with. It is something quieter and more disciplined. It is the precise inner act of not allowing an outer label to pass through the gate of your consciousness and settle as a governing truth. Refusal does not mean you are unaware of the world's information. It does not mean you are pretending that difficult data does not exist. It does not mean you are denying the reality of the closed door, the reduced number, the discouraging comparison, or the difficult season. Refusal, in the spiritual sense that Fox would recognize, means that you receive the information and you do not allow it to become authority. You hear the label and you do not say yes. This distinction is essential because many people confuse spiritual refusal with practical denial, and the confusion causes them to swing between two ineffective positions. Either they accept everything the world says and let it name their future, or they pretend the world has said nothing and call that faith. Neither position is the correction. The correction is to receive the information clearly and to refuse its authority specifically. To say inwardly, in the most deliberate and sober spiritual posture available to you, I see the report, I refuse the verdict. What does this look like in practice? It looks like hearing that the economy is contracting and not allowing that report to name your personal supply as finished. It looks like seeing a number in your account that is less than you need, and not allowing that number to speak a sentence about your future. It looks like reaching an age that the world considers too late for a new beginning, and not allowing the world's timeline to become your timeline. It looks like experiencing a failure, and not allowing the failure to become your permanent identity. The boundary you are establishing is not a wall between you and truth. It is a wall between you and the world's authority to declare what is true about your future. God names your future. The world reports your present. These are two entirely different functions, and the spiritual discipline of refusal is the practice of maintaining that distinction clearly inside your own consciousness, especially in the moments when the world's voice is loudest. Fox taught with great clarity about the importance of not allowing outer conditions to speak into the inner life with finality. He understood that the outer world would always be reporting something. There would always be difficult news, contracting economies, competitive markets, aging bodies, closed doors, and personal histories that contain failure. This is the nature of the visible world. It is always producing reports. The question is never whether the reports will arrive. The question is always whether the inner life will allow those reports to become decrees. Refusing the false name is also an act of respect for divine intelligence. When you allow the world to name your future, you are implicitly saying that the world's data has more authority over what is possible for you than the divine cause that is already at work. Fox would find this to be a kind of inversion. You are placing the report above the source. You are allowing the effect to govern the cause. And in doing so, you are closing the inner receiver to the supply that is already in motion on your behalf. The refusal is also a protection for your prayer. As we discussed earlier, prayer offered from an inner state that has accepted the world's verdict becomes divided prayer. The words ask for supply. The underlying expectation expects lack. The words ask for open doors. The underlying script sees all the doors as closed. Refusal clears this division. Before you pray, you refuse the name the world has placed on your future. You create a clean inner space. And from that clean space, prayer can be offered from the correct posture, from the expectation of supply rather than the anxiety of lack. There will be moments when refusal feels difficult, when the same closed door appears for the third time, when the number has not changed, when the comparison surfaces again, when the world's voice is amplified by someone close to you repeating the same verdict. In those moments, refusal is not a feeling. It is a decision. It is the choice to not install the incoming label as the governing name. You can feel the weight of the situation without making the weight the authority. You can acknowledge the difficulty without giving the difficulty the right to speak your future. This is what Fox meant by holding the spiritual position. Not holding it perfectly, without struggle, without moments of doubt or fear or discouragement, but returning to it again and again with the sober determination of someone who knows that the law is real and the source is infinite, and the world's naming machine has never had access to the full picture of what God is preparing. One practical way to practice refusal is to notice the specific language your inner life uses when it receives the world's verdict. Not to judge the language, but to see it clearly. When the number appears and your inner voice says, "I will never have enough," that is the label speaking. When the delay arrives and your inner voice says, "I am always behind," that is the accepted name running its script. When the comparison surfaces and your inner voice says, "I should have been further by now," that is the world's timeline being applied to a divine one. Notice the language. Name it as the world's name, and then refuse to let it settle as your name. Refusal is the gate. It is the first act of the renaming practice. Without refusal, all other spiritual work is built on soil that the world's verdict is still watering. But when refusal is established, when the inner gate is tended with care and discipline, the second act becomes possible. The second act is not just removing the false name, it is installing the true one. Fox was always moving in this direction. He never taught only the removal of error. He always followed the removal with the installation of truth. because the mind does not tolerate a vacuum for long. If you remove the false name without replacing it with the God name, the false name will simply return. The inner life needs a governing sentence. The question is always which sentence will govern it. The true name for your future is not the one the economy gave you. It is not the one your age gave you. It is not the one your past failures gave you, or your family history gave you, or the news cycle gave you. The true name for your future is the one that emerges when you return your consciousness to God as source, to divine supply as the governing reality, and to divine timing as the only timeline that has final authority over your life. To speak from God as source is not to make vague, enthusiastic declarations about abundance without inner substance. It is a precise act of consciousness. It is the act of turning the attention, the expectation, the imagination, and the inner posture toward the divine cause rather than the visible effect. It is the act of naming the future from the ground of infinite supply rather than from the ceiling of visible limitation. Fox would describe this as the correct spiritual allegiance. Allegiance is not merely a belief you hold, it is a direction in which your inner life consistently faces. When your allegiance is to God as source, you approach each day from the expectation of supply. When a door closes, you do not name it permanent loss because your source is not the door. When a number drops, you do not name it your final state because your supply is not the number. When the economy contracts, you do not name your future as contracted because your provision does not flow from the economy alone. Speaking from God as source means speaking a different language about your future than the world speaks. When the world says, "This is what your history shows is possible," you say God's supply is not limited by my history. When the world says this is the reasonable timeline given your age and circumstances, you say God's timing is not governed by the timelines the world considers reasonable. When the world says the channels available to you are insufficient for the supply you need, you say God is not limited to the channels I can currently see. This language is not fantasy. It is not wishful thinking dressed in spiritual vocabulary. It is the consistent application of the principle that cause precedes effect, that consciousness precedes condition, that divine supply is real and infinite and not dependent on the visible channels through which it temporarily expresses itself. The language of God as source is the language of cause. The language of the world is always the language of effects. When Florence Scovel Shinn spoke about divine order, she was pointing toward the same reality Fox named. Divine order means that the supply is already prepared, the timing is already perfect, and the right channels are already opening, even when they are not yet visible. To speak from divine order is to name the future from what is already true in the invisible cause, not from what is currently visible in the outer effect. This is why the God name for your future always feels a little ahead of the evidence. It should. The cause is always ahead of the effect. The seed is always ahead of the harvest. The spiritual fact is always ahead of its physical expression. When you name your future from God, you are not naming from what has already appeared. You are naming from what is already prepared in the invisible order. And that naming, held within a consistency and spiritual seriousness, begins to align your consciousness with the supply that is already in motion. What does this sound like in practice? It sounds like the inner sentence that says, God is my supply, and my supply is not limited to this one channel. It sounds like the inner sentence that says my future is governed by divine order, not by the world's timeline. It sounds like the prayer that does not beg but receives, that does not negotiate from desperation but aligns from faith. That does not ask God to make an exception for you, but affirms that divine supply is the rule and limitation is the exception. Fox taught that the inner state from which you speak the future is more important than the specific words you use. A sentence spoken from fear is not the same spiritual act as the same sentence spoken from a consciousness that has genuinely returned to God as source. The words can be identical, but the inner authority behind them is entirely different. This is why the practice of renaming is not merely a verbal exercise. It is an inner transformation. It is the genuine reorientation of the consciousness from the world's authority to divine authority. To speak from God as source is also to release the compulsion to control the specific channel through which the supply will arrive. One of the most common ways the world's naming power is reinstated after a genuine spiritual turn is through the habit of attaching the supply to one visible door. I need this specific job. I need this specific person to come through. I need this specific door to open. When that door closes or delays, the consciousness collapses back into lack because the naming was attached to the channel rather than to the source. Fox was precise about this. God is the source. The channels are the expressions. When one channel closes, another opens. The supply does not dry up, the supply seeks new expression, and the consciousness that knows this does not panic at a closed door because it knows the source remains open. This is the practical spiritual freedom that comes from naming the future from God rather than from the visible channels the world approves. Speak this over your future with inner authority, not as a desperate affirmation, not as a rehearsed phrase, but as the genuine naming of what you know to be spiritually true. God names my path. God names my supply. God names my timing. The economy has a voice, but it does not have my authority. The world has a verdict, but it does not have my future. My future is named by the source that has never been limited by what appeared and never will be. This is the second act of renaming. And when this act is performed from genuine inner authority, something in the consciousness shifts. Not always dramatically, not always immediately in the outer world, but the inner climate changes. The inner receiver opens. The prayers become less divided. The actions become less frantic. The imagination expands again toward what is genuinely possible when the source is infinite. And the consciousness begins to organize around the new name, the God name, instead of the world's verdict. Before you can replace the governing name, you must know precisely what name the world has installed. This is the diagnostic step, and it requires a kind of honest, sober self-examination that is not about self-blame or deep psychological excavation. It is simply the clear-eyed act of asking, what has the world called my future? The question sounds simple. Its answers often arrive with surprising weight, because most people have not stopped to name the name. They have been living under it without identifying it. The label governs the inner life precisely because it has remained unexamined. When it is brought into the light, when it is named clearly and deliberately, it begins to lose some of its invisible authority. Ask yourself honestly, has the world called your future late? Has it pointed to your age or your timeline or the number of years that have passed since a decision was made and suggested that you have missed the window? Has it shown you comparisons? Colleagues who have achieved what you are still working toward, people younger than you who have arrived at destinations you have not yet reached and drawn the conclusion that your opportunity has been foreclosed? Or has the world called your future poor? Has it looked at your financial history, your credit, your current income, your debts, the sector you work in, or the economic environment you operate within, and suggested that sufficient supply is not what your life is organized to produce? Has the language of financial limitation become so familiar in your inner vocabulary that it no longer registers as a name, only as a fact? Perhaps the world has called your future too damaged. Perhaps there are decisions made long ago, relationships that ended badly, careers that collapsed, opportunities that were missed at what seemed like the crucial moment, and the accumulated narrative of those experiences has been organized by the world into a story about who you are and what you are capable of. And somewhere along the way, you began to tell that story about yourself. The name may be impossible. When you look at the specific future you most deeply want, the world may have named it impossible, given your resources, your connections, your location, your background, or your past. The impossible name is perhaps the most suffocating because it removes the category of hope entirely. It does not say it will be difficult, it says it cannot happen. Some people carry the name forgotten. The world, through its distribution of attention, recognition, and opportunity, has consistently overlooked them, and the message received, consciously or not, is that they are not among those to whom supply and opportunity and recognition naturally flow. The name of forgotten is particularly insidious because it attacks not just the future, but the sense of divine relationship. To feel forgotten is to feel that God's ordering principle does not include you. Take a moment now, genuinely, not to feel heavy, but to feel clear, to sit with the question of what name has been installed. You may find one primary name. You may find several that operate together, forming a compound verdict about your life. Late and insufficient and too damaged together create a particularly dense script. But whatever the names are, they can be identified. And what can be identified can be refused. The diagnostic is not designed to produce despair. It is designed to produce precision, because the refusal and the renaming that follow must be specific to address the specific name. A general spiritual practice applied to a vague problem rarely produces the transformation that a precise inner act applied to a precisely identified false authority produces. Fox was always moving toward precision. The law is precise. The correction must be equally precise. Here is another dimension of the diagnostic. The world's name often carries an emotional signature. It is not just a verbal label, it is a feeling tone that accompanies the label. Late carries a feeling of urgency and inadequacy. Poor carries a feeling of shame and unworthiness. Too damaged carries a feeling of disqualification. Impossible carries a feeling of futility. Forgotten carries a feeling of isolation. Notice not just the word, but the feeling. Because the subconscious operates primarily through feeling. The name that has the most lasting power in consciousness is the one accompanied by the most consistent emotional tone. When you identify both the label and its emotional signature, you know exactly what the renaming practice must address. You know the specific false authority that has been governing the inner climate, and you know what it must be replaced with. Notice the moments in your daily life when this name activates. Perhaps it activates when you check a financial account. Perhaps it activates when you receive news about the economy. Perhaps it activates when you encounter a comparison, a birthday, a conversation with someone who has achieved what you have not. Perhaps it activates in the early morning before the day has given you any new information as a default inner state that requires no triggering event. These are the pressure points of the false name. These are the moments the renaming practice must most deliberately address. This diagnostic work is not designed to make the false name feel more real or more permanent. It is designed to make it visible. A name that operates in the dark of unexamined assumption has far more power than a name that has been brought clearly into the light of awareness. And once it is clearly seen, once it is named for what it is, a false authority that the world installed without your informed consent, the act of refusing it becomes not only possible, but necessary. The central decree of this teaching is this: the world does not name my future. God names my path, my supply, and my timing. This is not a collection of optimistic words. It is a declaration of spiritual allegiance. It is the formal inner act of transferring the naming authority from the world, with its statistics and fears and historical data, back to God, with the divine order and infinite supply and timing that does not calculate from limitation. This decree is the God name spoken deliberately over the false name that has been operating in its place. The decree must be spoken from a specific inner posture to carry its full weight. It must not be spoken from panic or from desperation. A decree spoken from panic is still operating from the emotional field of the problem. It is using spiritual language to describe an inner state that is still governed by fear. Fox would recognize this as the divided prayer again, words pointing toward God, inner state still pointing toward the world's verdict. The correct posture for the decree is the posture of inner authority. It is the posture of someone who has turned from the appearance and turned toward God, not because they are pretending the appearance does not exist, but because they know that the appearance is not the cause. From this posture, the decree is not a request. It is not a negotiation. It is not a prayer of desperation. It is a naming. It is the act of a consciousness that has returned to its proper authority, speaking the truth of that authority over its future. Speak the decree in the morning before the world has had a chance to name the day. Before you check accounts, before you read news, before you receive messages that may carry the world's verdict, take a moment of genuine inner stillness and speak from divine authority. The world does not name my future. God names my path. God names my supply. God names my timing. Let the words land in the consciousness with intention. Do not rush past them. Do not use them as a warm-up before the real business of the day. They are the real business. Because the inner state from which you enter each day shapes the quality of every prayer, every decision, every act, and every moment of receptivity that follows. Speak the decree when the false name activates. When you see the number and the inner voice begins its familiar script, speak the decree directly into that moment. Not loudly, not dramatically, with the quiet, calm authority of someone who knows the law. The number is a report. It is not my source. The world does not name my future. God names my supply. This is not denial of the number. It is refusal of the number's authority to be the final word. Speak the decree before sleep. This is particularly important, and Fox, along with Joseph Murphy, understood the pre-sleep state as one of the most powerful moments for inner impression. The last governing thought before sleep tends to influence the deep mind through the night. If the last thought is a rehearsal of the world's verdict, the inner life absorbs that rehearsal throughout the sleep cycle. If the last thought is the God-named decree, the deep mind holds a different instruction. Before sleep, speak simply and with genuine inner intent. The world does not name my future. God names my path, my supply, and my timing. And let the sleep that follows be a rest in that truth. Speak the decree when a comparison surfaces. The comparison is one of the world's most efficient naming tools. It places your timeline against someone else's and draws a conclusion about your adequacy. When the comparison activates the familiar label of late or behind or insufficient, the decree interrupts the script. God's timing is my timing. My path is divinely ordered. The world's timeline does not govern the divine sequence of my life. The God-named decree becomes more powerful with consistent use, not because repetition is a magical formula, but because consistent inner repetition gradually replaces the emotional tone of the false name with the emotional tone of divine authority. The feeling of late, rehearsed for years, has a deep groove in consciousness. The feeling of divinely timed, spoken with genuine inner authority from the God-name posture, begins to create its own groove. Over time, with honest, non-perfectionistic practice, the God name becomes the dominant inner climate rather than the exception to it. Do not measure the success of this practice by immediate outer change. The outer change is an effect. The inner change is the cause, and the cause precedes the effect, sometimes by days, sometimes by weeks or months. The measure of success in the God name practice is whether the inner authority is shifting, whether the false name is losing its throne, whether the prayers are becoming less divided, whether the imagination is opening again, whether the inner climate is gradually and genuinely moving from the world's verdict to the God name. We opened this teaching with a moment of recognition. Someone has already told you what is possible for you. That sentence was the open loop. Now the loop closes with a revelation that changes the entire meaning of the situation you have been navigating. The revelation is this: you have not simply been receiving the world's verdict about your future. You have been answering to it. There is a difference between a name being spoken and a name being answered. When you answer to a name, you recognize it as yours. When a false name is spoken, and you continue to organize your life around it, to shape your prayers from it, to reduce your effort and narrow your imagination in response to it, you are answering to it. You are living as if it is your true name. This is the revelation that most people cannot see from inside the experience, because they are too close to it. They see the outer circumstances. They see the closed doors, and the difficult numbers, and the long delays, and the missed comparisons. What they do not see is that much of their inner life has been organized as a response to a name that was never authentically theirs, a name the world gave, a name assembled from statistics and appearances and fears and other people's timelines, a name that has no roots in what God has spoken. Think about how a person lives when they believe their true name is late. They approach new beginnings with a kind of preemptive apology. They qualify their ambitions before presenting them. They work hard, but with an inner weariness that comes from acting against a verdict rather than from a ground of expectation. They pray, but with the undertone of asking for a special exception rather than receiving a natural expression of divine supply. They hold back their full inner investment from their own future because the name they are answering to suggests that full investment is foolish. This is not laziness. It is not lack of faith in the religious sense. It is the entirely rational behavior of a consciousness that has answered to a false name long enough to begin organizing its life around the false name as if it were identity. And identity, once established, whether true or false, becomes the ground from which all decisions, all prayers, all efforts, and all expectations are measured. Emmet Fox taught that the primary spiritual task of the human being is not the achievement of outer conditions. It is the correction of inner identity. Who do you know yourself to be? What name does your consciousness answer to? Because the self that knows itself as divinely supplied, as operating within divine timing, as connected to an infinite source that no outer condition can interrupt, acts differently, prays differently, decides differently, and receives differently than the self that has accepted the world's label. The revelation is not accusatory. You did not choose the false name. It arrived through accumulated outer experience, through repeated exposure to the world's verdict, through the natural human tendency to let what is visible and persistent begin to feel more real than what is invisible and certain. The false name installed itself gradually, and the correction is also gradual. But the revelation, the moment of clearly seeing that you have been answering to the wrong name, is not gradual. It is precise. It is the moment the open loop closes. Here is the depth of the revelation. When you have been answering to the name late, every prayer carries the inner assumption of someone who is behind. When you have been answering to the name forgotten, every act of service or creation carries the inner assumption of someone who is overlooked. When you have been answering to the name insufficient, every financial decision is shadowed by the inner assumption of someone for whom enough is not natural, but exceptional. And because consciousness is creative, because the inner assumption shapes the quality of the inner state, and the inner state shapes what can be received, the false name eventually produces the kinds of conditions that seem to confirm it. This is not fate. This is not God withholding supply from those who answer to the wrong name. This is the law of consciousness, operating according to its own nature. Consciousness shaped by a consistent inner assumption tends to organize experience in ways that mirror that assumption, not as punishment, as law, and law operates impartially. The same principle that allows a consciousness rooted in false lack to produce limiting conditions also allows a consciousness returned to divine supply to produce expansive ones. The question the revelation invites is simple and transformational. What would your inner life look like if you stopped answering to the world's name? What would your prayers sound like if they were offered from the name God gives you, rather than the name the economy or your age or your history has given you? What decisions would you make? What risks would feel appropriate? What imagination would you allow? What supply would you expect? These are not rhetorical questions. They are navigational ones. They point toward the corrected inner state. They indicate what is possible when the false name loses its throne and the God name is installed in its place. And the installation is not a far-off spiritual achievement. It begins in the precise moment you decide that the world's verdict is a report and not a decree, and that only God has the authority to name your future. Living from the new name is not a dramatic change visible to the outer world. It is a deep change in the inner orientation from which every action, prayer, decision, and expectation flows. It is the difference between a life organized around what the world has declared possible and a life organized around what God has prepared. When you live from the God name, you pray from supply rather than from lack. The prayer is not a request made from the desperation of someone who has been named insufficient. It is a turning toward the source from which all supply flows, with the inner expectation of someone who knows that the source is open and infinite. This prayer is not passive. It is active in the deepest spiritual sense. It is the precise inner act of aligning consciousness with the cause rather than dwelling in the appearance of the effect. When you live from the God name, you act from order rather than from panic. The actions you take are not the frantic scrambling of someone trying to outrun a world that has named them behind. They are the ordered, deliberate steps of someone who knows that divine timing is governing the sequence of their life. The effort is real. The engagement is full. But the emotional tone behind the effort has changed from urgency rooted in the fear of the world's verdict to the calm confidence of someone acting from supply. Living from the new name also changes the relationship with outer conditions. The bank statement is no longer the authority on your financial future. It is information. You use it for practical planning, but you do not allow it to speak your identity. The economic report is no longer the authority on your supply. It is context. You are aware of it, but it does not govern your expectation of what God can provide. The comparison is no longer the authority on your timeline. It is one data point. It does not measure the divine sequence of your particular life. Fox would describe this as freedom from false authority. Most people believe they are free as long as no outer power is coercing them. But Fox understood that the most powerful form of unfreedom is not outer coercion. It is inner allegiance to false authorities. When the bank statement governs your inner state, you are not free even if no one is forcing you to check it. When the economy names your future, you are not free even if no law compels you to believe it. When the world's timeline judges your progress, you are not free even if no one has spoken the judgment aloud. True inner freedom, in the framework Fox taught, is the state in which God is the only final authority, not the only information, not the only voice you ever hear, but the only voice you allow to speak the final word over your future. The world may report, the economy may contract, the timelines may not align with what you hoped, the doors may delay, but none of these have the final word. God names your path, God names your supply, God names your timing. When you live from this name, your imagination is freed. The pictures of the future that seemed too large, too unreasonable, too far from the evidence become available again. Not because you are living in fantasy, but because you have returned to the correct understanding of cause. Cause is not the visible condition. Cause is the divine order working in and through consciousness. When the imagination is grounded in that order, the pictures it holds are not wishful thinking. They are inner alignment with what the source has prepared. The nights are different when you live from the new name. Instead of lying down in rehearsal of the world's verdict, carrying the weight of late and poor and behind into the subconscious sleep, you lie down in the simplicity of divine order. You have done what ordered action required. You have prayed from the correct posture. You have refused the false name and spoken the God name. And now the deep mind is given a different instruction, not one of anxiety, but of trust, not one of scarcity, but of supply. This is not a promise that every morning you will awaken to changed outer conditions. The law works, but it works as a cause works, ahead of the effect in the invisible order before the visible one. What changes first is the inner climate, and the inner climate, consistently changed, eventually produces a visible change in conditions. Fox never promised a specific timeline. He promised a reliable law. And the law is this: consciousness aligned with divine supply tends to attract the conditions of supply. Consciousness governed by the world's verdict of lack tends to reproduce the conditions of lack. Living from the new name is not a destination you reach once and maintain effortlessly. It is a daily practice of return. There will be mornings when the old name reasserts itself. There will be moments when the world's voice is so loud and so persistent that the God name feels thin by comparison. These moments are not failures. They are precisely the moments the practice is designed for. The return each time from the world's authority to God's authority is the practice, and each return strengthens the capacity for the next one. This is the corrected state, not a life immune to challenge, not a consciousness that never hears the world's verdict, but a consciousness that has established its inner authority clearly enough that the world's verdict no longer has the final word. The future is named by God. The supply is named by God. The timing is named by God. And the person who lives from that name is genuinely, spiritually, and practically free in the deepest sense that Emmet Fox understood freedom to mean. Consider a person. Let us call them someone you may recognize not by name, but by inner experience. They are not young by the world's accounting. They have reached an age that the world, in its efficient way, has decided marks the end of certain beginnings. The job market they entered decades ago has changed around them. The industry that once felt like their domain has transformed. And the people who appear in the spaces where they used to feel at home seem younger, more current, more adapted to a language and a pace that feels newer than they are. They have not been idle. They have worked. They have tried. They have made efforts that were sincere and sustained. But something did not arrive when it was expected to. The business that should have grown did not grow as it was supposed to. The career pivot that seemed like the right direction led to a period of uncertainty, rather than the opening that was anticipated. The timing, somehow, consistently seemed to be one beat behind what was needed. And so, gradually, without a formal ceremony, without a conscious decision, the world's name settled over their life. Too late. The name arrived through conversations in which people, often kindly, suggested that certain windows had passed. It arrived through the numbers in accounts that told a story about what 50 or 60 years of work had and had not produced. It arrived through the internal comparison, that quiet, relentless measuring of where they were against where the world said they should be. They continued. They still went through the motions of effort and sometimes even prayer. But something in the quality of the inner life had changed. The prayers had become smaller. The plans had become more cautious. The imagination had contracted from what was genuinely possible to what was statistically defensible, given the age and the history and the market. They had answered to the name, not because they were weak, not because they lacked faith or intelligence or genuine desire, but because the name had been spoken often enough, by enough voices, with enough visible evidence to support it, that it had entered the consciousness without ever being formally challenged. When they lay down at night, they reviewed the evidence, the age, the accounts, the years, the comparisons, and the inner life, conditioned by months and years of answering to too late, organized itself around the emotional tone of that name. Not despair, exactly. Something quieter and more persistent. A resigned familiarity with the idea that the best that remained was making peace with what had not happened, rather than genuinely expecting what could still happen. This is the person in need of renaming. Not a pathetic figure, not a broken one. A real, intelligent, spiritually serious person who has been living under a name that the world gave and that the world cannot legally keep. Because the world's naming authority extends only as far as the appearance, and the appearance had never, in the deepest spiritual order, spoken the final word over this life. There is something worth honoring in this person's persistence. They continued, despite the weight of the name. They kept moving through the days, even when the days felt like evidence of the verdict. That persistence is not the proof that the name is right. It is the proof that something in them, beneath the name, still knows the name is wrong. Some undamaged part of the inner life still refuses, even quietly, to accept that too late is the actual truth. That refusal, however faint, is the beginning of the renaming. Fox would look at this person not with pity, but with recognition. He would name what he saw. Not the age, not the history, not the closed doors. He would name the accepted label and point directly to the inner moment where the false authority had been granted. And then, with the calm precision that characterized his teaching, he would show the exact correction. Not a new motivation strategy, not an outer overhaul, one inner act, the refusal of the false name, and the return to God as the only authority qualified to name this life. The shift does not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It arrives quietly, the way true inner changes most often do, in a moment of stillness where the person, perhaps in the early morning before the world has spoken its verdict for the day, pauses and asks a different question than the one they have been asking for years. They have been asking, how do I catch up? How do I recover the time? How do I compete against people younger and more current than I am? These are the questions that live inside the name too late. They all assume the verdict is accurate, and the only task is to manage within it. The new question is different. What name does God give this moment of my life? Not the name the world assigned, not the statistical calculation, not the comparison. What does divine order, which has never been limited by chronological age or by the world's sense of reasonable timing, say about what is possible from here? And in that stillness, something shifts. It is not the sudden appearance of money or opportunity or external confirmation. It is an inner loosening. The held tension of answering to too late begins to release. Not all at once, not completely in a single morning, but genuinely. The grip of the name softens, and the space that opens is not emptiness but possibility. They refuse the name, not with dramatic words, with a quiet inner act of non-agreement. The world has called this too late. I do not accept that name as my authority. God names my timing, God names my path, and God's vocabulary does not contain the phrase too late for those who turn toward divine order. From that refusal, one ordered action becomes available. Not 10 actions, not an overhaul. 1. The door that seemed irrational to approach under the jurisdiction of too late now appears as simply a door. The prayer that seemed presumptuous for someone with this history now appears as simply a prayer. The step that the old name would have dismissed as foolish now appears as simply the next step in a divinely ordered sequence. They do not know how the path will unfold. Fox never promised that renaming would produce a detailed, visible map. He promised alignment with the law. And the law says that consciousness aligned with divine supply tends to attract the conditions of supply. The timing that God ordains is never the world's timing. It arrives differently, through channels that the old name would never have looked for, in sequences that the world's statistical analysis would not have predicted. The outer world may not immediately applaud this shift. The numbers may not immediately change. The market may not immediately recognize what has changed in the inner life. And here, Fox would offer his most important caution about this moment. Do not reinstate the world as judge. Do not measure the validity of the renaming by whether outer conditions immediately confirm it. The outer confirmation is an effect. The inner renaming is the cause. The cause always precedes the effect. What changes first is the quality of the life from the inside. The nights are different. The person lies down no longer rehearsing the old story, but holding the new name. The mornings are different. There is a quality of expectation, not frantic chasing, but genuine inner openness that was not present under the weight of the old label. The prayers are different. They are offered from supply rather than from lack, from the position of someone whose source is God, rather than someone whose source has been named as insufficient by the world. This is the new name lived, not a fairy tale, not instant transformation. A genuine, practical, spiritually grounded change in inner authority. God names my timing. God names my supply. And from that name, even one step taken in genuine alignment with divine order becomes a step taken in freedom. For the next 7 days, you are invited to engage a specific practice. It is not a system of perfection. It asks for honesty, consistency, and willingness. Nothing more. Each morning, before you check accounts, before you read news, before you receive any message that the world may send about the state of things, take 3 minutes of genuine inner stillness. In that stillness, identify the name the world spoke about your future yesterday. It may have come through a number, a conversation, a news item, a comparison, or simply the default inner state that activated before the day gave you any new information. Name it clearly, and then refuse it. Speak the decree. The world does not name my future. God names my path, my supply, and my timing. Let the refusal be deliberate and the decree be grounded. Each evening before sleep, repeat the practice in its simplest form. Review the moments during the day when the false name activated, when you began to think or act from the world's verdict. Do not review them with judgment, review them with recognition. This was the false name operating. And then close the day with the God name. The world does not name my future. God names my path. And carry that decree into sleep as the last conscious instruction to the deep mind. When the false name activates during the day, and it will, do not treat each activation as a failure. Treat it as a practice opportunity. The false name activates, you notice it. You name it as the world's verdict, not God's truth. And you speak the decree quietly, inwardly, from the posture of spiritual authority, rather than from the urgency of someone trying to outrun a verdict. Each refusal, however small, is a genuine act of inner renaming. 7 days of this practice, honestly engaged, begins to shift the inner climate in a measurable way. The practice does not require perfection. There will be days when the false name runs for a long time before you notice it. There will be moments when the outer evidence is so persistent that the refusal feels thin and the decree feels empty. These are precisely the moments the practice is most valuable, not least. The law does not ask for the absence of difficulty. It asks for the return to God when difficulty arrives. And each return is itself the practice. By the seventh day, you may find that the false name has less automatic authority in the inner life. Not because the outer world has changed necessarily, but because the inner authority has been exercised consistently. The God name has been spoken deliberately each day. The subconscious has received a new instruction each night. The consciousness has practiced for 7 consecutive days the act of refusing the world's verdict and returning to divine authority. This is not magic. This is the law of consciousness applied with discipline and honesty. Do not abandon the practice after 7 days simply because the outer evidence has not yet caught up to the inner change. The inner change is the cause. The outer confirmation is the effect. Continue the morning and evening practice beyond the 7 days, not as a rigid obligation, but as a natural spiritual discipline, the way you would maintain any habit that has begun to produce genuine inner clarity. If this teaching has opened something in you, something that recognizes the false name and wants to return the naming authority to God, then subscribe to Sacred Logic now. This channel is for those who have decided that the visible world is not the final authority. Every teaching in this curriculum is designed to deepen that decision and to translate the invisible spiritual laws into practical inner correction. Subscribe and receive each new teaching as it arrives. And now, before we close, the decree that belongs to this teaching. Write it in the comments, not as a performance, as an act of inner commitment, as the naming of your new spiritual position. Write, "The world does not name my future." Let that sentence be more than a comment. Let it be the formal inner act of transferring the naming authority back to where it belongs. The world has been speaking. You have been listening. From this point forward, you receive the world's report without granting it the authority to declare your future. God names your path. God names your supply. God names your timing. The world does not name your future. There is a teaching in this curriculum that follows naturally from what has been opened here. Because once you have begun the practice of refusing false names and returning to divine authority, the next question that emerges is this: what other false authorities have been governing the inner life? What other outer voices have been given permission to speak into the consciousness as if they were the source? The teaching on false authority addresses this precisely, and it belongs in sequence with what you have received today. Every layer of sacred logic builds on the previous one. The spiritual laws are not isolated. They form a curriculum. Each teaching opens the next level of understanding, and the next level, for those who have genuinely engaged with the renaming of their future, is the identification and correction of every false authority that has been operating inside the inner life beneath the level of conscious awareness. Emmet Fox spent his life teaching that the human being was not designed to be governed by outer conditions. The universe is ordered by spiritual law, and that law always favors the consciousness that has returned to God as source, as cause, as the naming authority over all things. The visible world reports, the invisible cause governs, and the person who knows this, who prays from this, who acts from this, who rests in this, is the person who is genuinely living from the God name. You were not designed to answer to the world's label. You were not created to be governed by the economy's verdict, the market's report, the comparison's judgment, or the accumulated record of what has not yet appeared. You were created to live from the inner authority of a consciousness aligned with divine supply, divine order, and divine timing. The world called you late. God calls you positioned. The world called you insufficient. God calls you supplied. The world called you too damaged. God calls you ordered. The world does not name your future, God does. And God's vocabulary has never contained the word impossible for those who return to the source with a genuine inner act of spiritual allegiance. Emmet Fox knew this. The law confirms it. And now if you have received it honestly, you know it too, if this teaching has restored the inner order, like this video. Subscribe to continue the Sacred Logic curriculum, and carry the God name with you into the next teaching, the same decree alive in your mind, the same authority established in your consciousness, The world does not name your future, and now you are learning to live as if that is true.